Tu hai parlato di movimenti che si vanno radicalizzando negli Stati Uniti e cercano anche forme di organizzazione autodifesa, se ben capito anche armata, no? Nei confronti della pacificazione che sta. Il famigerato secondo emendamento, quello che permette ai cittadini americani di portare le armi, è uno strumento che viene utilizzato anche in questo caso da questo tipo di movimenti per la formazione, per la radicalizzazione di questi movimenti che vanno cercando in altre comunità del mondo dei modelli organizzativi, no? In cui entra in gioco anche l'autodifesa delle comunità. Utilizza l'emendamento americano sulla possibilità dei cittadini di armarsi privatamente. Per esempio, il Black Panther Party ha usato questo emendamento, per esempio, perché spesso qui in Italia si vede quell'emendamento soltanto come un atto criminogeno che favorisce l'industria degli armamenti, mentre in America talvolta è stato usato anche l'emendamento, o no? Se puoi rispondere molto in breve, very brief.
So the movements, the movements have relied on the Second Amendment to assert the legal right to own weapons, but they don't assert it in the same way that that the far right does. So the Second Amendment is it's a contradictory thing, right? On the one hand, it was put in place, it was all about preserving property. They wanted to have an armed citizenry to be able to mobilize to put down slave rebellions, right? On the other hand, it was a reaction to this idea that a standing army was totalitarian, right? So, there's seeds of the Second Amendment that are deeply reactionary and white supremacist, right? And then there are, elements of it that might contain a critique of state power. So, I would point to, the Young Lords, the Young Patriots, the Black Panthers, represent a continuation of maybe that more anti-statist trend, right? And, there's been other people in different countries that have made similar arguments. George Orwell during World War II looked to the Home Guard as a way to try to bring the model of Barcelona and the Spanish Civil War to the UK and turn war mobilization into a push for socialism. So, when we're confronted with these, horrific powers of the state to make violence and to surveil and monitor us, I think it's at least worth considering things beyond liberal or even social democratic reformism. So, the facts on the ground in the United States have brought movements there, and I figured I would pose the question and the dilemma for my Italian comrades, right?
Question for both of you. Yes. So as you show in your presentations, your research seems to be placed located at the juncture of pacification processes and resistance. So the simplest question would be, how do we, in your experience based on these cases, how do we do research on pacification, state-order repression without reproducing them? How do we address these issues, right, and show processes without becoming ourselves tools, terrifying tools of those processes, and without going to the other extreme, something rosy or illiterate, right? How do we?
Io ho una domanda che potrebbe essere banale, ma in realtà è molto vicina a quello che sta succedendo qui sul territorio. Qui abbiamo un'azienda privata che si occupa della sicurezza dei cantieri d'auto e ha dei compiti, sicuramente tra questi però non ha la possibilità di fare delle cose che sono almeno in Italia, prerogativa dello Stato, quindi arrestare dei cittadini. Io non ho capito se l'esempio che portavo, quello di Tages One, invece per esempio in quel caso è possibile che facciano tutto degli arresti e usino la forza, che qui è forza pubblica, forza privata pubblica. Grazie.
Yeah, so to your question, that's been like a major focus of my work, is like sort of what I'm calling kind of the geopolitics of representation, which is how do you go about critiquing state violence without reproducing the terms on which it rests. And one of the reasons I've been so concentrated on the idea of the laboratory in relation to Palestine, but also elsewhere, is I feel that it basically reappropriates a stare. The Israeli state also uses the term laboratory when they explain themselves in sort of private literature and selling Israeli weapons. And so I've been thinking about how do we turn that concept into something that isn't simply a reaffirmation of the state narrative. And in an article that I just published earlier this year, I've thought about a few different sort of methodological things. In my work, I deal a lot with sort of private contractors and representatives of the Israeli state. And so there, I think when we're doing field work, there's a question of how do we represent empirics. And for me, that's been taking a kind of skeptical account where I actively try to not reproduce the narrative they're telling me, at least not on the terms that they're telling it to me in. And I've been quite critical of some of my other colleagues who write on that topic because I feel they take it as kind of proof or evidence that something is happening rather than a very sort of politicized and a kind of political spin that's very clearly itself kind of a form of ideology. And then also, this has not been so much of my work thus far, but I think sort of the concept of embodiment and sort of looking at violence not in terms of just other people's representations of it, but how it feels, how it is practiced, how it becomes part of everyday life. And there, I think feminist approaches are have been some of the most sophisticated in terms of taking seriously experience and lived experience and embodied experience as a way to kind of challenge state violence without, again, reproducing the terms on which it rests. So I think there's a lot more work to be done there, and I think with policing in particular, there's particular challenges of secrecy, and when you get access at all to the police in any form, what can be done with that information, to what extent it is reliable, and those are things that I'm continuing to think about a lot.
So on the first question about how to avoid like reproducing the terms of the state, I mean, I have like two parts of the answer. I mean, the first, for me, I got into academia, with a very deliberate personal goal to do work that supports movements and in dialogue with movements. So like my research has been informed in pretty direct ways by my conversations with people now in Black Lives Matter organizations and Democratic Socialists of America, dealing with questions about police abolition, right? So my analysis is shaped by that kind of ongoing dialogue, right? So that's like the personal orientation that I've chosen to take. Some people would probably dismiss me as a political hack, but that's their loss, right? On the other piece of it is the analytic choice of pacification and the critique of security. So I mean, what I really enjoy about this theoretical project is it begins with a kind of deep engagement with bourgeois thought and a critical reappropriation of some of the terms to to kind of reveal the systemic class biases, you know, of bourgeois thought. So what do I mean by this? Right? Let's take for an example the work of, you know, civil libertarians on issues of police and surveillance. Right? They uncritically accept the notion of privacy and don't, you know, consider the relations between privacy and private property and capital. Right? So just by centering those relations, by centering the relation between property, privacy, and capital, it brings a different analysis, and it causes, you know, like very early in my research, the facts on the ground, the type of police violence, the routine police violence, not against movements, but against, you know, working class populations and surplus populations, you know, quickly showed me that privacy was a pedantic, legalistic concern that was not going to be a very powerful social barrier to state violence, right? So pacification has given me a language to critique that and to advance, you know, in dialogue with those movements I mentioned, advance maybe an emancipatory analysis, right? On the other question about private security, with the example of Tiger Swan, they do not have powers of arrest, right? But they, in North Dakota, they would, you know, detain people and then turn them over to local law enforcement. In that intelligence group I mentioned, the kind of ad hoc working group that was created to manage the protests, right? There was the Tiger Swan with the Fusion Center and then all these other police agencies. And Tiger Swan, as far as the documents go and the journalists I've talked to about it, you know, Tiger Swan appears to be the most, you know, the most aggressive, that they were pushing, you know, pushing the police to take more confrontational action, that they were taking intelligence from state and local law enforcement and, you know, making their own products with it, doing their own operations. So that is the relationship there, and I think it's a unique one that reflects the way the state has changed in the neoliberal period, and it brings us back to, you know, an earlier period, or has some resonance with an earlier period, you know, before the welfare state, you know, when the work of pacification and police violence was much more privatized, right?
I think with that, we'll bring this panel to a close. So an applause for our panelists.